In this 15-minute video, I'll be talking about how a person becomes a trauma survivor. I'm Dr. Denise Colson, the author of the Strategic Trauma and Abuse Recovery System. I have two goals in sharing this video with you. If you're a trauma survivor, I want to help you understand how trauma has affected you and why it's important to heal from past trauma. If you're a counselor using this model, I want to help you learn how to talk to clients about how they became a trauma survivor so that they can understand more about themselves, whether you're sitting in their office or on telehealth. So let's begin. One of the core principles in trauma informed care is stop asking what's wrong with you and start asking what happened to you. Most clients come into our office thinking something's wrong with me and going to find out what it is so I can fix it. We, as counselors, psychologists, or psychiatrists, typically focus on what's wrong with the person. We codify their symptoms, give them a diagnosis. Of course, we have to give a diagnosis, something we have to do, but we can link this assessment to the root of the problem. We can ask them what happened to them by exploring their past history, including their traumatic experiences, and connecting them to their current symptoms, or as I like to say, their survival responses. So, in order to do this, I have developed what I call the Trauma Survivor Blueprint. This is an attempt to explain to a client how they move from an experience of trauma to a trauma survivor identity and pass it on to the next generation. But we need to explain this in a way that people understand. And I want to explain it now to you. So here is the entire trauma blueprint, and it's broken down into stages. And it's also broken down into the near term or the immediate experience of trauma and the long term or long term impact of trauma. And then it's passed on to the next generation through the trauma symptoms, through the survival responses. As we think about this, we're going to take a deeper dive into each of these phases. Here's the trauma survivor blueprint, the initial impact. An event outside of your conscious control contradicts expectations, values, beliefs, and you experience loss. That means that the event could be anything from being left out of a game at school to experiencing a rape. The impact really isn't defined by the event itself so much as by the experience of the person. If you've ever watched the still face experiment on YouTube, you'll see that the mother only stops interacting with the baby. She doesn't leave the room, yell, or anything else. She just keeps her face still. The baby clearly experiences this as traumatic. Now, in stage two, the brain interprets this event as threatening, triggering the limbic system of the brain. This is the fight or flight response of the brain. And the amygdala is the part of the brain that acts kind of as the smoke detector. And when it smells smoke, it says danger, danger, and it triggers a whole series of responses in the brain. Stress hormones are released, adrenaline's pumped into the body, and we begin to prepare to respond to the danger, either through fight or flight. And the grief response begins. So, our definition of trauma is any event outside of your power, control, or conscious choice, which contradicts your identity, your values, beliefs, and expectations to the point that it raises your stress to toxic levels and creates unacceptable losses. And this then leads to the grief response. Here we see a picture of the limbic system of the brain here in the center, with the amygdala being the part of the brain that's the smoke detector. And the common responses are fight or freeze or flee or because we're human, fix. And immediately this grief response, this is how it's seen on the outside of us is through grief. And it, if you watch the still face experiment, you see that the mother resolves this event with the baby by continuing to interact with the baby again, reconnecting, reattaching, and the baby is able to move on. Sometimes things happen to us that are very traumatic in the moment, but the grief response begins. We have support, we have help, and it's resolved. But it's the unresolved grief, the grief that gets repressed, where the information is stored in the brain that moves the cycle of becoming a trauma survivor forward. And we move into the long term impact. In stage 4 here, what we see is that the brain rallies to survive. This means that we develop survival responses. Many people call these symptoms. While we see the immediate impact in stage 1 and 2, which included the fight or flight response, these are new behaviors, new attitudes, new beliefs. These beliefs and attitudes help us to survive, but sometimes these responses are outside of our personal core values and beliefs. For example, I talk about the time I was assaulted at knife point in 1988. I immediately fought, yelled, and screamed for help. When I could, I ran as fast as I could to get away. This was my fight or flight response. Later, when I was with friends, I mean, months, even a year later, when I was with friends, someone came running up behind me like the attacker had done, triggering the amygdala in my brain that said, fight. And I turned and kicked my friend as hard as I could. It wasn't very accurate, but I kicked as hard as I could. This was my survival response. Now, in stage 5, because our brain is always working, always comparing our behaviors and thoughts to our core values and beliefs, we are going to see that this hurting a friend contradicts my core values and beliefs. And so I'm going to experience more losses. The limbic system is triggered again, and we move into stage 6 with more emotion, more grief. And now we're going to go back to stage 4, circle back, and now we'll develop survival responses to our survival responses. So, for example, in my case, to avoid hurting a friend and embarrassing myself, maybe I just withdraw and stay at home. And so you see, it goes round to 5 and 6, creating more losses and more grief. So I just keep cycling at this point through stages 4, 5, and 6. Now, during this time, I'm losing connection with the original event in my brain. It's no longer being connected to that original event that started the whole cycle. And so I begin now to see myself really as the source of the symptoms, not the event itself. So as I begin to only focus on my survival responses and ask what's wrong with me, my perception of myself changes. My personal identity begins to change. For example, a few years ago, I was feeling bad about not accepting the engagement ring my husband first gave me. It was really pretty and fancy, but I insisted that we go buy just a solitary diamond. I was thinking maybe I was just so controlling and that nothing was ever good enough for me. I was thinking bad about myself, that this was my identity. And so I asked my husband, do you remember why I didn't want to keep that first engagement ring? And he said, of course, you were afraid it would attract attention and someone might want to rob you. And it was a repetition of the fear that I was going to be attacked again. And I remembered, oh, yeah, that's right. I also realized that I had healed from that. I could now wear a fancy ring. So for our anniversary, he got me one. But when you haven't done your own trauma work through the strategic trauma and abuse recovery system, You become defined by your new beliefs, behaviors, attitudes, your survival responses, and your personal identity changes. And you begin to see yourself maybe as a bad dude. I have to fight to get everything, or everyone is out to get me. So I have to be ready to fight at all times. And you begin to behave this way around other people. And all other people can see, of course, is behavior. And they can't see your past or understand why you're behaving the way you are. So they begin to treat you like you are a bad dude or a tough chick, or like you're going to fight with them. So you're defensive, maybe even scared of you. The truth is that most counseling nowadays is cognitive behavioral in nature. That means that they focus here on the surface of the iceberg because they believe that those irrational thoughts, those problem behaviors are the problem. But with the 12 STR, or Strategic Trauma and Abuse Recovery System, we believe that most of what's going on is beneath the surface, that what causes what's happening on the surface is rooted beneath the surface. And so we have to get down into those deeper issues in order to see lasting and successful change. And so it's not that we never, as you see in the trauma survivor blueprint, address the symptoms, but this is where the most cognitive behavioral therapy starts. They start trying to change people. And we start in stage one by identifying the wound and identifying the event that happened, and then working through the stages in the order in which they developed. We do this in a structured way by using a three-phase process. Phase one, establishing safety and stabilization. Phase two, reprocessing and grieving. And phase three, reconnecting and reintegrating. So eventually we do look at symptoms, but we bypass them, if at all possible, using this structured plan. So in phase one, what we do is work through each stage. Stage one is admitting I'm wounded and powerless, but not helpless. There's a difference between powerlessness and helplessness. Stage two, stop trying to fix myself and humbly ask God to heal me, participating in the healing. And then in stage three, accepting that I have to grieve and stop numbing with substances like alcohol or marijuana, or stoicism, the idea that I don't have to feel bad feelings. And then finally, stage four, partnering with a counselor or recovery coach to move on to phase two. You can read more about these stages in Break Every Stinking Chain, Healing for Hidden Wounds. And these are available on Amazon.com. There is the paperback, the hardback, there's a Kindle version, and there's an Audible version of the book. And there is a paperback version of the workbook. They're very affordable. Just go to Amazon.com, type in search Break Every Stinking Chain by Denise Coulson, PhD. After you've completed phase one, you're going to move on then to phase two. This phase needs to be done really while partnering with our trained facilitator or associate facilitator. In phase one, using the book and workbook, Break Every Stinking Chain, you can actually work through this on your own or maybe in a small group. You can work through it with your counselor, and all you do is read a chapter in the book, work through a chapter in the work, and you can get through all 7 chapters. And then it's time to partner with a counselor or facilitator and work through these stages. So let's just read those briefly. This is the reprocessing and grieving phase. And so in stage one, I'm sharing my story in writing and reprocessing my grief. Stage two, identifying and sharing my interpretations, beliefs, and their impact. Stage three, identifying survival responses then and later, contradicted expectations and losses. Stage four, making a comprehensive list of my losses. Stage five, choosing forgiveness, forgiving the perpetrator and forgiving myself. And stage six, making a spiritual or personal marker. Now, as you move through this phase, And as you complete this phase, you may have more than one source of trauma. So we work through one source, not one story, one source of trauma at a time. So you may have had a father who was abusive or a mother who was an alcoholic. And so you may have to go back and work through these stages again on another source of trauma. Otherwise, you can then move on to stage 3. And in stage 3, this can be done one-on-one with a 12 STR facilitator, or again, back in a group, in a coaching group, or in a support group, or in a family session with a 12 STR coach. So we keep the focus on trauma recovery and healing, not on changing you. Our goal isn't to improve you, but to allow God to heal and transform you. This all starts with changing your focus from what's wrong with me to what's happened to me. And as counselors, we have to start, as our clients come in, changing our focus from what's wrong with you to what's happened to you. I hope you found this short video to be helpful. If so, please be sure and like it below and share it with your friends. I also have a book, Trauma, 10 Reasons Why Christians Need to Be Talking About It, available on Amazon.com as a paperback and on Kindle. And this will give you a basic introduction to trauma and the importance of beginning to talk about trauma. Please visit us at traumaeducation.com or elccc.org to learn more about the Strategic Trauma and Abuse Recovery System. Thank you.